Okay, it looks like we are connected on everything. Twitch, Facebook. Oh, gonna go live here in a second on Facebook. Maybe. It shows connected on Facebook, but I'm not showing that I can go live. Am I live on Facebook? Looks like I'm connected. We're starting a little early, of course, always to check on our technology because there's always something funny. So do fast forward if you're watching a video about 4 minutes before we get started here. What do you think about Facebook there? Nothing from Facebook? Okay. I'm going to reboot Facebook and see what happens here. It shows connected, but nothing on my side. So weird. Can we say we hate Facebook? Okay, I think we're reconnecting here on Facebook. I think it changed my address again. Okay, I can go live on Facebook now. There it is. Alrighty. Cool. Cool, cool, cool. Okay. Yep, I'm showing connected on Facebook. Hi, everyone. We're going to start here in about another minute. I think I got everything for today. Lots of notes. Okay. And I'm pretty sure my sound is working. It is, what is today? Let's see. Okay, so I'm good for both. I'm going to start here in another minute. And one more camera adjustment before we get started. Whoop. Okay. Not bad. Not too bad. Oh, that was very nice. So, what's going on here? So it's a reset from being gone for, I don't know, how long have I been gone? 12 days? 13 days in total? Something from Facebook anyway, or from the studio. Anyway, so had to readjust, reinstall everything because I took everything with me to Virginia. Everything's been brought back, which gave me an opportunity to once again clean off my workbench again, which will still be a continued work in progress here. Anyway, okay, it's 1 o'clock. You want to get started, babe? Okay, so it is 1 o'clock Eastern time. Today is Wednesday, October 7th. It's week 29. It's demo day basic soldering. We're going to touch base on basic soldering today and bring everybody back to the same page again, because I know many of you have not been here. Many of you are just getting started, and you know, we don't want to just leave you behind. And I felt like it's been 29 weeks, heck, since we started doing this. And maybe I should just, you know, take a minute to touch on some of the basics so that you can all jump in if you so desire. But a couple things going on. What's going on? Oh, today's our anniversary. If you've been following along, you know that Andy's in my ear. He's my producer. He's also liking and commenting on Twitch and Facebook so that I don't have to, and telling me whatever questions you have so I don't have to do that. But it's our 20th wedding anniversary today, and we are choosing to work and do this. But we'll celebrate it this weekend, which is great. What else is happening is today is Wine on Wednesday. It'll be at 4:30. The link for the Zoom has already been posted on the Facebook Q Talk page, and you can register to join us this evening at 4:30 Eastern. You can join late too. It's okay. I know a lot of you are still working, which Yeah, we're trying to work too. Anyway, so you can definitely join us. It is always the first Wednesday of every month. So if you can't join us this month, you can join us next month. And we've been doing it. I think this is the fifth or sixth one that we've done. So it's always a good time. So that's Wine Wednesday. We have a Zoom coming up on Friday, but all the kits have been sold out. Sorry, everyone. However, the next Zoom next week is going to be the Nova pendant. So you can see there. And there's still a few kits of that left. And then Step by Step Surprise, we're going to kick that up again start that up again next week, next Wednesday. And there's, how many kits are those left? There's a few of those kits still left. So if you want to join us, you still can. And we can still get this probably out on time to you if we get it out tomorrow or the next day. If you haven't registered for those coming up yet. So you can find all those classes and registration on the urbanbeater.com. Just go to the classes and Q Talk and you'll find where all the classes are there and even past classes. So that's the easiest way to get registered. If you ever have any questions about anything that we're doing here, do just go ahead and reach out to me on the Q Talk Facebook page. Just send us a message and one of us will answer you, more than likely me. But anyway, we'll try to answer you and all that good stuff. So yet another thing here is the urbanbeater.com has all of the things that we're going to go through today. If you need to order any of the soldering supplies, we definitely have it on our website. Okay, so let's get started. So first things first, let's talk about the product that we have to use to solder with. Something that always comes up is Pickle, of course. You definitely need to have Pickle if you want to do this. Pickle is basically an acid that is used to remove fire scale. Fire scale is basically oxidation. Okay, so we all know that sterling silver oxidizes over time. That's basically the copper coming up to the surface, right? So if you add heat to it, it will oxidize immediately. So what do you do to remove said oxidation? So you can sit there and you can sand it, file it, or you can pickle it. So pickle comes in a lot of different forms, but the one that we use most is Sparax. Okay, so Sparax is approximately something like 4% sulfuric acid by volume, and it's a fairly common pickle. Why do we call it pickle? I only just recently learned that it's because back in the day they were using pickle juice. I don't know, but I'm going to go with that in any case. So if you buy Sparax, it comes dry. It says here in granular form, and then you just add water to it. Okay, there are many forms of pickle, as I mentioned. You can definitely use vinegar and salt. I find that it is not a very effective way to pickle anything, so I don't go down that road. It just takes too long for me. So another thing about pickles, you want to make sure that you're using it warm. You don't see it on the screen because I have my pickle pot off to the side, but it is a mini crock pot and you can buy these at Walmart, Target, but I prefer actually to go to the Salvation Army or your secondhand store because you can pick them up for like $5. The last two I picked up were at the secondhand store for $5, and what's crazy is typically they're new, which is great. So anyway, so you want to use it in a little mini crock pot. It'll keep it warm because you want your pickle to be warm when you're using it because it works faster. You can definitely use cold pickle, but you're just going to be sitting there for a while. And for me, if I'm sitting here working through my process, I just want to get through my process. I don't want to sit around waiting for pickle to work. And okay, so pickle. A little more on pickle. How do you know that it's working? Well, it's pretty clear. Once you oxidize your metal, it turns to black, right? Whether it's copper, brass, or silver, it turns to black. And then what you do, after you quench it, you put it in the pickle. And after some time, usually about 30 seconds to a minute, depending on how much you have oxidized your metal, it will come back. All the black will go away. And if it's copper, it turns pink. If it's silver, it turns white. So that's how you know it's working. If it is taking forever, more than likely you have contaminated your pickle. So remember, the rule is the only thing that goes into pickle are non-ferrous metals, metals that do not have iron in it. So copper, brass, silver, gold are the only things that go in there. You do not put nickel in there. You do not put German silver in there, which is really nickel. And you don't put steel in there. That's why you always have a pair of copper tongs hanging out. You can also use chopsticks, but many of you, I know you don't use chopsticks, but you can use chopsticks if you happen to have some plastic tongs. You can use plastic tongs too, which of course I have some plastic tweezers here because, you know, we've got a little bit of everything. Anyway, so you can definitely use those items to take things out of your pickle. You really don't want to put your hands in there because it is an acid and it's not good for you. Another thing too is you don't want to put your face over the steaming acid because it's not good for you. So just make sure that you keep safe. Regarding pickle and how to handle it, if you have contaminated, again, you know that you contaminated it because nothing's working. It just sits there and nothing changes, right? So you can definitely, I'm sorry. So that's how you know that it's been contaminated, or you decide that you never want to make jewelry again. So how do you dispose of it? You need to neutralize it with a little baking soda, a little bit at a time. You add like a teaspoon of baking soda in a little bit at a time until it is completely neutral and non-reactive, and at which point you can dump it. If you don't want to take care of it, you take it to your local hazardous waste removal. Here they do it only in the summer, so I hang on to things like that and take it to them, but a lot of places they do it monthly. But just check with your local municipality and they'll tell you when hazardous waste disposal is happening, and you can just take it to them, tell them what you have, and they will handle it for you. So that's another safe way of handling pickle. Okay, so that's pickle. If you have any questions, by the way, through this next 45 minutes, an hour, just shout out. And like I said, Andy is my producer and he'll tell me in my ear what your questions are and I'll answer that. Okay, so the next item is Flux. Okay, so Flux comes in a lot of different forms also. And the bottom line of Flux is that you will choose the kind of flux that makes you happy. See, actually, I even have handy flux here. That's a paste. So everybody has been taught with different kinds of fluxes, and that's really becomes personal preference, okay? So I was taught on the green flux, and we use it with a, it's a squeeze bottle with a needle applicator, and I can apply it directly onto my metal. Some people like to use it in a spray bottle, and then there's handy flux, and where it is actually a paste and you take a brush and you brush it on. But again, there's many other fluxes out there too. So that becomes preference. How do you know? I would just go with whatever the instructor teaches you to use and just use that until you decide, oh, you want to be a little adventurous and try something else. What is the use of flux? Flux is basically a primer that helps condition the metal so that the solder will apply to it. Okay, so that's basically what flux is in layman's terms, right? So it's sort of etching the surface so that the solder will adhere to it. Okay, so when you're soldering, you have to have flux. If you don't have flux, the solder won't do its job. It won't flow. It won't adhere all the pieces. So that's the point of flux, okay? Another thing that flux also does is it reduces fire scale. So some people like to flux their entire piece so that they don't get fire scale, or it reduces fire scale. And so there's a little bit less cleanup. This is why people like to use the spray flux so that they get it all over the surface. Frankly, I don't like spray flux because it gets all over my workbench. I know. Again, they're just nuances and differences in how you do your work, but no judging. It is just sort of what it is. Okay, so then the next critical item you have is solder. Hello, we're learning how to solder. You have to have solder when you're learning how to solder. But before I go into solder, what's the difference between soldering and fusing? So basically, fusing is asking two pieces of metal to come together with just heat, right? So they both come to a melting point. And because they are at a melting point, they sort of merge, sort of like two pats of butter in a pan when you melt it, right? With solder, it's basically metal adhesive. You're asking two pieces of metal to come together with solder, right? Sort of like glue. How do you bring two pieces of paper together? Glue. So that's basically what solder is. Now, solder comes in a lot of different forms, okay? It comes in paste. Now, if you are buying paste, it has the flux already built into it. However, you do want to go ahead and buy the flux and keep it on your workbench, because if you heated it incorrectly and you have burned off the flux, the solder will not flow. You're going to need to have that flux to reapply to get that solder flowing again. That is a common mistake. Now, a lot of people I've noticed, they sort of, I'm going to say cheat, but they're doing it the shortcut way. Instead of adding more flux, they keep adding more solder paste. But the problem with adding more solder paste is that you have, I guess I'm going to call it buildup, and it becomes a mess. It's more and more solder, which means the joint is less and less neat, right? So instead of adding more and more solder, you just add some flux to get the solder to flow, okay? So that's why even if you buy solder paste, you want to make sure that you have some flux on your workbench. So solder paste comes in silver, and it also comes in gold, and it comes in copper. So that's so you can get whatever whatever metal you're using. I'm sorry, Andy, there was a okay. So in any case, the next one is going to be solder also comes in wire, okay, and it looks just like silver wire. If you are using wire, you need to make sure that you mark it, because the day you mix this wire up with the regular wire that you have, with the sterling silver wire you have, oh yeah, it's going to be a mess, because it's just going to turn into a big puddle very, very quickly. So that's the hint there. So you want to make sure that you mark your solder wire if you're using solder wire, okay? And a lot of people, they make different bends on the end of the wire so they know which one it is. I actually typically have a sticker on there, so I always know what that wire is. Now remember, if you're using wire, you have to have flux, because in paste, the flux was already built in, but in wire, obviously, it's not. So you need to make sure that you have flux, and that's the only way it's going to work. The next product is going to be sheet and chip, okay? So in here, I have sheet, and it's different colors because I actually took out a marker and I colored it, okay? So I have a color system. So this is a sheet of solder, all right? And I went ahead and colored it in red. So I have it marked so I know which solder is which. Even when I go to cut it down, you can see the tiny little, right there, tiny little chip that I have cut. And if you flip some of these little ones over, they'll still be green. So even if my solder goes flying and it's all over my workbench, or I've made a mess, I always know what kind of solder it is. So I've created a color system for myself to mark my sheet. Now chip is basically the same thing, except it comes already pre-cut into these little tiny pallions, okay? So chip and sheet are the same thing, except in different sizes. Again, with chip and sheet, you will also need flux to make that happen. Okay, so those are the different kinds of solder. Most solders for other metals do come in wire. I'm unaware that copper comes in sheet, but in any case, they all will need flux to make it work. All right, so those are the products that we have to make that happen. Solder also comes, I don't know if you noticed that, if you're new here, solder also comes in hard, medium, and easy, okay? So with hard, medium, easy, why do we have all these different levels of solder? It's because we're doing step soldering. At every level of solder, okay, the melting temp goes down. The reason for that is so that you don't open the previous joint that you just made. Because if you're heating everything up and you bring it up to that melting temp, potentially that second joint will open up, right? So solder is basically about 75% silver to 25% copper, tin, other, which reduces the melting temp, okay? So that's hard solder. I'm sorry, that's hard solder. Then you have, and at every level, the percentage of silver goes down. So it goes from 75 to 70 to 60, okay? So what do you start with when you start soldering? I always say you start with the hardest solder that you have, because if you have not planned your project properly, or that you have screwed up a joint somewhere along the line, you always have these other steps afterwards so that you don't blow open that first joint. Now, so the question is, how long does paste solder stay good for? I was told that it should last indefinitely. Okay, is what I was told, and that it should not dry out. Another thing too that I was told was that you can keep it in the refrigerator if you are worried that it's, you're not using it. But I'm going to show you something. This is sort of funny. Okay, so my store used to be BQ, and this is from, can you guys see that? 08. And why do I still have a tube of solder from 2008? Is because it's IT solder. Okay, I don't use it very often, little did I know. So yeah, I'm still using it, and frankly the last time I used this was, I don't know, 6 months ago. That's how often I don't use this, and I had way too much. In any case, so it stays with me until it is until it's done, but it's still working. So I think you should be safe to hang on to your solder for a pretty long time. Okay, so what's even funnier is I had a previous, oh wow, look at that. So now that I'm looking at this, I had a customer who contacted me just a couple months ago from my store, which closed 7 years ago, right? So this customer said, if if I was interested, she was really trying to downsize, and these people, they're getting up in age, and she doesn't want any of this stuff anymore, so please come get it. So I did, and in her collection of things, check this out, I just noticed, look, solder from 07, and actually this one is, what one is this one? It's medium solder. Oh, it's easy solder, right? Oh, I'm reading it wrong. There it is. It's easy solder, and I actually used it last week, so 07, it's still good. I'm sorry, Andy, what was the question? So IT solder, let's go through that one more time. Okay, so typical solder comes in hard, medium, and easy. At every level it goes down. It starts at about 75% silver. IT solder is considered intense heat solder. It's approximately 80% silver. But the thing is, most people don't use IT solder. Most people haven't even heard of IT solder because it's used so seldomly. As I just demonstrated, it is only used with fine silver. Because the melting temp is so high, you will more than likely melt your sterling silver before you get it to work. So that's what IT solder is. It's also goes by the name of eutectic solder. So there's my story. Okay, I hope that answers the question of what IT solder is. I would suggest that you do not Google IT solder, as I have, because it's solder. You'll get nothing out of it. So just remember, think intense heat solder or eutectic solder. Do not ask me how to spell that. I don't know. Anyway, okay, so there it is. That's why you have the different solders, right? And the different what am I thinking? And all the different chemicals that you're going to need. Because of all those chemicals that we are using, and of course because of the gas that we are using, you want to keep yourself safe. So make sure that you work in a well-ventilated area. If you're in a small area, make sure that you have a vent, okay? But not only do you need a vent, an outtake, you need intake also to keep the air circulated. This is how we're going to keep ourselves safe, right? Another rule when you're soldering is you want to make sure that you work over your workbench. You do not want to work over your lap, because if you drop something hot, it's not good. And also, do yourself a favor, make sure you're wearing cotton clothing is a good thing, and not polyester, because it will just melt to you if it does drop on you. And if you really want to be extra cautious and safe, wear an apron. An apron's a really good thing. Some people go so far as to wear a leather apron. I just have a cotton apron, and that's what I have a tendency to wear. And additionally with that is I can wipe my hands on the apron and I don't have to carry around a rag. Extra bonus. All right, so let's go through a little bit more of how to do the soldering thing that we keep talking about, right? So here I have a tripod with a hole. It's a little worn, but there's several soldering surfaces that you can be using to solder on. So one of which is a tripod. When do you use a tripod? For me, I use a tripod when I need very little heat sink, right? So if I have a piece, a larger piece especially, and I'm only using a butane torch, and that's part of the problem is butane torches don't get that hot, right? So you want to make sure that you don't have any heat sink. And things like solder boards and solder bricks have a lot of heat sink. And what do you mean by solder brick? I mean, oops, just dropped something here. Something like this. I mean, this is not a magnesium or solderite board. This is like probably a pound. It's ceramic. So there is a lot of heat sink in that board. So if it's a bigger piece, I always go to a tripod with mesh because there's no heat sink here. It allows the heat to come through. Another reason why I would use a tripod with mesh is when I need to come in from underneath, right? If I need to heat a piece from underneath, this is how I'm going to do it. Because again, obviously, if you have a board, how are you going to get heat from underneath that piece, right? So typically I will heat from underneath if I have a mismatch piece like this, where you have a backplate. Yes, these are just samples, by the way, it's just a demo. So if you have a backplate that's so much bigger than the piece that you're trying to solder on, you want to get that backplate really hot first. And had you just come from above, right? Had you just come from above and heated it over the top, what's going to happen is you'll get this little piece hot and you won't get the bottom piece hot enough because you got to get the two pieces to come to the same temperature for the solder to flow. So that little piece is going to get hot and more than likely you'll melt it before it solders. And that's why we heat from underneath. Okay, so that's why you need that's why you want a tripod with mesh. Okay, so someone asked about heat sink. What is heat sink? So basically, heat sink is when let me think about this. When like a solder board, I don't know how else to put that. Okay, so this is a solder board. Actually, I'm going to pull out a solder brick here too. Hold on. So I have a firing brick here too. You see how thick this is? Okay, so it's when what you're soldering on that piece is sucking all the heat away from the piece you're trying to solder. So say if I'm heating here, right, and I put this down and I try to solder this, and you're finding, oh God, it is not heating. It's not soldering. Sorry, I dropped something. Okay, it's not soldering. Why is this not soldering? It's not soldering because this piece here is sucking all the heat away from what I'm trying to get hot. That's heat sink, okay? And it's really funny. Okay, I know this is a horrible story, but it tells you we all grow, we all learn, right? So when I first learned how to solder, there was really nobody around to teach me how to do it, and I didn't understand any of these, especially heat sink. And so here I have a bench block, right? This is an anodized bench block. At the time, I had steel bench blocks, right? So I had this steel bench block, and you know, this customer of mine was like, "Oh yeah, this is how you solder," and she doesn't mention to me anything about heat sink and the soldering surface. So my take was, "Oh, you know, it's a piece of steel, then I won't ruin my table. Why not?" So I literally, because I didn't own anything but a torch at the time, I literally tried to solder a piece on a bench block. And I'm like, you know what? I don't get it. It just doesn't work. That's because that steel bench block was sucking away all the heat and did not allow my piece to get hot enough for the solder to flow. Okay, hopefully I answered the question. And then embarrassed myself at the same time. But anyway, so that's what heat sink is. So you have to be sort of careful about the surface in which you're using to solder onto, right? So why do we even sell things like this? Why do we even use things like this? Honestly, I don't know. This is one of those acquisitions I had literally when I first started doing this, and I pretty much learned the hard way. I'm not completely clear, except, well, actually I say that. Okay, if you're using an acetylene torch or a propane torch that burns almost twice as hot as a butane torch, then you could get away with a board like this. Now, another thing too is they'll last longer. But with a butane torch, no way. I would never use a ceramic board like this. It just takes too long and too much effort and too much gas. So it's easier just to get into a solderite board, or we even have solder boards here that we use, that we sell. So here's a solder board, you know, because there's very little heat sink. Another thing you can also use is basically a honeycomb block, okay? So what's the advantage of a honeycomb block is there's less heat sink than a solid board, but the real advantage here is you have these pins that comes with the board. See? And you can pin things in place without a lot of effort, you know, without putting things on there that will create heat sink. Because again, back in the day when I started, it's like, I don't know, 13 years ago at this point, people would say, oh yeah, you know, if you need this to stay in place, take out a penny or a nickel or whatever and put it on there to weigh it down. Well, all those things are heat sinkers, I'm going to say. I don't even think that's a real word, but I'm going with it. Okay, they're like heat sinkers, and which means they're sucking the heat away from what I'm trying to solder. Whereas if you do something like this with the little pins, you're fine. It's not taking any heat away from you. Okay, I don't think you can see the pins, but I'll do it like that so you can actually see what I'm doing there. Okay, so that's what that is. So that's another thing you can that you can solder onto. Remember, if you're soldering on your workbench or your kitchen table, you want to protect the kitchen table, you can use a cookie sheet, but you never ever want to use a cookie sheet as a soldering surface, right? You don't want to apply heat directly onto said cookie sheet. Well, you'll burn the table underneath, that's one. But two, there is a coating on there on, I'm going to say most cookie sheets, there's a coating, right? That stainless, or sorry, that non-stick coating, sort of toxic with the torch, actually really toxic with the torch. So you definitely don't want to be torching that surface. So if you're using a cookie sheet to protect your table, you do want to lift your board off of the sheet so that you're not torching directly, or you know, happen to torch directly onto said sheet. So I prefer, frankly, if I was actually working at a kitchen table, I would probably put my board on top of my tripod or something like that. And another thing that will help make life really easy when you're doing pieces that you have to come all the way around is like a rotating solder surface. These are really handy, and you can even put your honeycomb surface on top of that. Okay, so those are your soldering surfaces, right? Another thing that you need is you will need some fire tweezers, all right? So fire tweezers, the key here with the fire tweezers is that there is a fiber grip handle, okay? This will keep your fingers safe because you don't want to be holding on to the metal because it's going to get hot and it's going to burn you because remember, metal distributes heat, therefore it gets hot. Okay, so always when you're working with a torch, you always want to keep a pair of fire tweezers in your hand. You can use cross-locking or you can use straight tweezers. That's a personal preference too. And also for me, it's a lot to do with when what I'm doing. Sometimes I just don't like the cross-locking and I use the straight tweezers. And other times I really just want a pair of cross-locking tweezers. So that's the difference there. All right, so, oh, and then of course there is a solder pick, okay? Mine's very beat up, but anyway, so it would probably be straight when you get it, not bent like mine. But anyway, so a solder pick is really helpful too, because if you need to push pieces around while you're heating, okay, just in case something decides to go lopsided, it's nice to have a fire tweezer so that you can move things around. All right, any questions there so far? So good, we're doing okay. You guys are following along. I know I talk really fast. It is a thing. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and solder a couple pieces together so you can see what the heck I am talking about. All right, so easiest thing to do is to solder two pieces of metal together, right? And, oh, I know what happened. Solder two pieces of metal together and use solder paste. So I'm going to do paste first, and then I'll do a little pick soldering because I don't discuss pick soldering very often, and I thought today might be a nice time to just throw that into the mix just to show you one more thing, one more way to do this for those who already know how to do this. Pick soldering for me is probably the most complex soldering that you can do. And so actually we'll start with these two rings, right? So I have these two rings, and if you wanted to solder them together, easiest thing to do is put some solder paste on it. Okay, so this one for some reason is warped, so I'm going to flatten it. So I'm flattening it because it will help the pieces come together. Okay, so there's a rule that you need to keep track of. When you're soldering, you want to make sure that your pieces are touching, that there's no gaps. Some people teach you to go ahead and leave the gap and fill it with solder. I'm going to tell you they're wrong. It's not a very elegant way of doing it, and it may cause problems later. So you want to make sure that when you're soldering, your pieces are touching in some fashion or another. Okay, solder is not meant to fill a gap. Now, that said, the only time I'm filling a gap with solder is when I'm desperate. And the other thing too is if you're using paste, it's really hard to fill a gap with paste because paste doesn't like to bridge so much. Whereas, so if you're absolutely desperate, pull out some sheet or some wire solder to fill that gap. It will do a much, much better job. So here I'm just going to take a little bit of solder, tiny little bit, you can see there, and I'm just going to put it right here. And I'm just going to squeeze it together like so. Okay, and we're going to heat it. This is copper, so we're just going to heat it right here. If this is silver, you need to heat everything and get all the pieces evenly hot before you hit that joint. So a lot of people, what I see is they heat around the joint like so, and they avoid the joint altogether. I don't know who taught them to do that, but everything has to get hot pretty much at the same time. So get everything hot and then hover over that joint, and then what you're going to see, and you might have seen that, is it becomes, the solder looks like liquid silver. Even with copper solder, it'll look more like a nickel color. So it needs to look like liquid. Okay, if you're using if you're using paste solder, it's going to look like sand as it's starting to flow. If you stop and it still looks granular, you haven't gone far enough. Okay, so that's a big nuance between wire solder and paste solder. Okay, so make sure when you're using paste that you're heating it so that it looks like liquid and it becomes even like metal, okay, and not looking like granular. All right, so then, oops, here we go. So there you go, okay, it's been heated. Always quench it, the entire piece. You don't want to just quench where you solder because remember, it's metal, it's hot. Okay, so there it is, it's quenched, and it is a solid piece. Throw that into the pickle. All right, so another thing too is when you're soldering, make sure that you are always putting the torch in your your less dominant hand. Why? Because if something hot goes flying, what do you have more control of? Your dominant hand. So you want to be able to grab those hot pieces more easily with your dominant hand. And as I mentioned earlier, when you are soldering, you always want to make sure if there's a torch in your hand that there's a tool in the other hand. Typically a fire tweezer is best, okay, so that you don't grab hot things. It's not to say that hasn't happened before where, oh, look, there's a pair of tweezers in my hands, but I'm just going to grab that hot piece because, you know, I'm not thinking. But hopefully it'll prevent you from burning yourself. So that's what you want to do there. All right, so I just soldered 2 rings together with paste, and then I put it into the pickle. All right, so we're going to go to another one. So that was pretty easy, right? So here, this isn't really a bezel, it's just a piece of flat metal. And that I sort of haphazardly made into a ring. All right, so I'm going to solder this piece to the back plate. All right, several ways to approach this. First of all, I can apply paste on the bottom. And probably, again, the thing with paste is you don't want to sit here and spread it out like peanut butter. That's not a good idea. Okay, so you're going to put it in key points. So something this big, I probably put in about 6 different points, about a 2mm bead all around. Okay, and then I would just put it down, heat it, and solder it from below. Yeah, okay, that's an easy one. Let's do this with some stick soldering. It'll make it a little bit more interesting. So what's stick soldering? So here I have some wire, solder wire, and I'm just going to cut a little piece off. Okay, just like so, about 1 inch, more than I need, way more than I need. All right, and I'm going to put it in my tweezers. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and flux this entire piece. All right. So remember, if you're using wire and sheet, you need, if you're using wire and sheet, you need flux of some sort, right? And then I'm going to just dry flux it. Dry fluxing is not something most people teach, but it is a great little hint here. Okay, it's just a tip that works really well. Okay, so I'm going to heat it, heat the whole thing, and you see that? It's bubbling up. I'm basically just drying it out. You see? It's drying out. This is also something you want to do if you're using chip, because imagine you put all the little chips along the inside or outside. You put the flux down, you start heating it. Did you see how it bubbled up? Where does all the chips go? They float away. So what you want to do is you want to go ahead and dry it so that it's no longer bubbling up, right? Heat it from below too. So it's no longer bubbling up, and then put your chips down. Okay, so I'm just going to heat it like so, and I'm going to heat it some more from below, okay, until this becomes crystallized. Yep, the flux will look crystallized. That's when you know you can put your solder down and it will just flow. Okay, so that's your heat indicator. If you've not done this before, that's a big tip right there, because I'll tell you, when I was learning how to do this, nobody mentioned that to me. It's a key point here. So notice I'm heating from underneath. Let's see, how's my heat doing to camera? I think we're doing pretty good. Heating, heating, almost there. Bring this in, and there it is. And I touch it just like that, and it flowed all the way around. Yep, did you see that? It just sort of dribbled right on there. I still have most of my solder left, and it went all the way around. Now, I'm going to show you something here. And I knew this when I did this. Okay. So when I put this piece down, I knew that not all of it had made contact. Yeah, it was a demo piece. I didn't care. But I'm going to show you. Hold on. What happens? Okay. Because it wasn't touching, you can see that right there. Let's find some pliers. Okay, so watch. Because it wasn't touching, see that? It didn't solder. But everywhere else, see, I'm going to try to pry that apart. Everywhere else, it did solder. Okay, so that's what happens when you try to solder two pieces together and one area is not touching. So you need to ensure that that's working, or that everything is touching. Okay, so now you see what it all looks like. Okay, and you can also see here where the flux had flowed out to and how much less fire scale I have. So there are advantages to using the flux. So if you wanted to prevent fire scale on the whole piece, you could have fluxed the entire piece to reduce that fire scale. Okay, I'm going to throw this in the pickle, not that I'm going to keep this piece, but I'm going to throw it in the pickle just so that I can show you what it looks like when it comes out. All right, let's do another piece. This time, we'll do a little bit of pick soldering. How's that? Okay, let's think, what do I want to do? All right, So I have a ring here. I'm just going to snip it really quick, and we're going to solder that ring down, okay? Or a piece of it. How about I just solder that down to the back plate. All right, so this is, by the way, yes, I'm using copper, but this applies to silver also, okay? Okay, I am using silver solder though. All right, pick soldering. Let's see. So here I have that leftover piece of solder. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put it onto a bench block, and I'm going to flatten it gently. Not completely, just to prevent it from rolling, see? And the reason why I'm doing that is because I don't want it to roll away from me. Actually, we're going to do this on a board. So I'll answer that in a second. So I'm putting this on my my solder block because I need to ball this for pick soldering. There was a question just now, I don't know by whom, but I will come back to that answer here in a second. Let's finish this real quick. So I just flattened the wire solder, and I'm just going to cut a little tiny piece. Can you see that? Little itty bitty piece, about 4 millimeters. Should be enough, and I'm going to put it right there. Okay, you're going to need the your solder pick for this one. All right, and then you're going to need to flux this also, because remember when you're using, and you can do this with chip too. It doesn't have to be wire. Okay, so when you're using wire and wire and chip or sheet, you need to put flux once again. So here I'm just going to heat it like so. Okay, and then I'm going to heat this piece of wire till it balls up, and I'm going to grab it just like that when it balls up, if you can see that. And I'm going to heat this entire piece, including that middle piece, and I'm looking for changes in the flux. So once it starts crystallizing, I just put it down, and I missed. Okay, my hands got shaky. I don't know if you can see that, but I missed. I should have put it next to it. It went on top. The solder is flowed on top. So wait right there. I'm going to cut another piece. If I was actually doing this for real and I screwed that up, I would just flip that over. But I want to make the point here. So we're going to cut another piece of solder right there. Yeah, I probably would have flipped that piece over if I was doing this for real. So we're going to granulate that, and as soon as it starts balling up, I'm going to touch it with my pick to grab the solder, which now it doesn't want to behave. Dear Lord. Okay, come on, there it is. Okay, so there is my solder. I know you can barely see that tiny little bit of solder. I'm going to heat this back up one more time. I'm going to bring my solder pick in close, and I'm going to touch it right where I want it, not on top. And see, look, it just flowed right down the bottom. I touched it right on the end here, and it flowed right through. And I would tell you, pick soldering is probably one of the cleanest ways to solder if you're trying to keep your pieces neat. So, okay, so the question was regarding the last piece that I did. If I was doing a real piece, would I have soldered from the inside instead of the outside? So hold on, I'm going to pull it back out of the pickle, and we'll talk about it. Okay. So, okay. Thanks, Andy. Okay, so here, this piece. When I did this, I soldered from the outside. So the question is, would I have soldered from the inside or the outside if this was a real piece? Frankly, it depends. Okay, so if I was keeping the outside sheet as part of my design, I would have soldered from the inside. Okay, but if I was cutting this off anyway, right? So if I was cutting this off anyway, I just do it from the outside. It's just easier, less cleanup, less things to consider. Okay, and then the next question is whether or not I would have fluxed the oh, I can't think. I'm sorry. Whether or not I would have fluxed the wire. Answer is no. I've never had to flux the wire. But you know what's interesting now that I'm saying that out loud is interesting because when you pick solder, they tell you, which I have totally forgotten until now, they tell you to put flux on your chip when you're pick soldering. So I don't know, but hey, it seems to work and it seems to be enough flux that I've never had a problem. Interesting. Rules can be bent, right? Okay, so here we are. So this is what it looks like after you flux. Do you remember it was really dark and gross earlier? And it cleans up, okay? Let's see. So if you, if this was a real piece, the next thing you do is clean up with some steel wool or a brass brush, like so. And notice it polishes right back up. So you can see this side versus this side. Well, you can also see the mess that I made with the solder. How to remove that solder? Well, this is where it takes elbow grease to do it. So you just go in there with some sandpaper. And if you have some of these parts on your flex shaft, like a sanding disc or whatnot, you want to make sure, or you can use that. It'll go a heck of a lot faster, but you want to be careful that you don't create any gouges or things because the flex shaft is a piece of machinery and it goes really fast. So all you do is you go in with your sandpaper and you sand, and actually some of it's already starting to come off. So it takes a little practice to get it really nice and neat, but it will come off. It's just a matter of time. That's all. So here, same thing. You know, if these joints are a little dirty because you made a mess or because you're reusing a piece like I did, you can just go ahead and sand it and do that. Okay, see, look, it's mostly coming out. And it's getting shinier and shinier because I'm sanding it. You want to polish this up even more, you can also throw it in a tumbler. For the most part, I really prefer hand polishing for my pieces because it looks better. But anyway, so you can clean all this up and make the solder disappear. So a couple more helpful hints here for making neat and tidy solder joints, okay? So for something like this, I put it right in between. Another thing you can do too is you put it on underneath, right, instead of in between, because what happens is, remember, solder follows heat. So by heating at the top, it will flow through the joint and up. So it just sort of fills that joint very gently and connects the two pieces. So putting solder underneath and asking it to come up is a great way to go. All right, so let's go through a couple rules of soldering very quickly here. So the rules of soldering, as I mentioned, the first one is it has to be clean, right? So I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. The sandpaper, somebody asked what's a grit of the sandpaper. I use 400, 500, and 600, so depending on how bad it is and how much work I want to do repolishing it, I sort of adjust from there. So right there, that was 400. And if it was just a little bit of solder, I would use like 500 or 600 to clean it up instead of going to something so heavy. Okay, so back to the rules of soldering. As I mentioned earlier, when you're soldering, you need to make sure that your pieces are clean, okay? So if it has a lot of fire scale, remember, fire scale is oxidation. It has a lot of fire scale. It's basically a barrier to the solder and the pieces won't solder. So you got to make sure that it's clean. So you clean it by sanding it, filing it, or pickling it. Okay, so that's the first rule. Second rule is it has to be touching. Okay, because generally you don't want to fill a gap with solder. There's a lot of cleanup on the end and it's not a really great joint. It's a much better joint if you get those pieces to touch really nicely. Okay, so if you're having problems with soldering, that's probably one of them. Is one of the top 3 things that can go wrong is your pieces weren't touching. All right. Number 3 is you need to heat evenly. You need all the pieces to come to the same, especially in silver, to the same temperature so that the solder can flow evenly between the joints. So here, if I was soldering these 2 pieces again, okay, but I only heat this oval one. If I'm only heating this oval one, the solder will not flow evenly in between the pieces, right? So then the solder just goes to that oval one and never make the connection. So that's why you want to make sure you heat the whole thing evenly, especially if it is silver. Now, if you were truly doing the copper, you would just heat back and forth between the two pieces at the joint. You don't necessarily need to heat everything, okay? Same thing with gold. So with gold, you can totally spot solder, right? So if this was gold, you just put the heat right there between the two, and boom, you are done, okay? So with every metal, it's a little bit different, and you just need to understand the nuances of that as things aren't working. But those are the 3 rules that you want to stick with. Make sure it's clean, make sure it's touching, make sure you heat evenly, okay? So if you have any questions about that or you're having problems, one of the easiest way to assess those problems is just take a picture and send it to me. Give me some dimensions. Because, I was recently talking to somebody who said, my bezels, they just never stick. I can't get any of my bezels to stick. It's like, how big are they? How big is that back plate? Where did the solder flow to? So like the bezel, say this, right? If you were soldering this piece and the solder is flowing all over that back plate, but it doesn't make the connection, it very well could be that you didn't heat the top piece. That's typical. So, but if it only flowed to the top piece, guess what? You didn't heat the back plate enough to get that solder to flow between both pieces, you see? So hopefully that makes sense to you a little bit, okay? And not too often do I get oh, I forgot to put it in pickle. Typically, people do remember to put in pickle. How many times can you pickle it? Honestly, you can pickle as many times as you want. Some people would pickle in between every single joint, every time they put heat on it. I'm not that person. Unless I have produced enough fire scale, I don't pickle it, right? I know, because it's so far away. It's only 12 inches to my pickle pot. So it's such a far distance. I can't pickle it. No, that's, I just like to progress pretty quickly through my process. And so far, so good. It's not a bad deal. It's just about how much you've tormented your piece and how much fire scale you've produced. That's all. Anyway, okay. So what else? What I've got to teach you a tip to use letter. Okay. So what else can I tell you? I think that's about it. I mean, so basic soldering is pretty I see. Uh, basic soldering is pretty straightforward. It does take a lot of practice. If your joints are really ugly or messy, that takes time. As you work through it, you'll come to learn and understand how much solder you need or don't need, and then you go from there, right? It's like everything. There's a learning curve. So Linda was asking about magic solder paste. So we also have another product called magic solder paste. It is actually solder powder, and what it is it's basically metal powder that you need to add flux to. So I don't happen to have any here. I'd have to go get it, but we're just going to go with it right now. So basically, it's actually, maybe I do have some right here. You just add a little bit of solder, of flux to it, and you make a slurry out of it. Oh, I do have a little bit here. Let's see. See, it's powder. Yeah. So there you go. And we're currently sold out. Reach out to us if you need some. We're on back order for that product right now. But you just put it in a little container and you add flux to it and make a slurry of it. The nice thing about that is you can control how much solder you're actually using. A lot of people like to use it for their filigree work, and that's the magic of that solder. And also, some people are starting to use it with things like their bezels and whatnot. They're finding that there is a little bit of control with that product, whereas with paste, where somebody else mixed it for you. So anyway, so again, that was just a really basic touching base on soldering and how to get started. We do have a soldering kit on urbanbeater.com if you have not gotten started yet. And let's see. Oh, and so another question is sweat soldering. What is sweat soldering? So I'll touch on that really quickly before I end here. But that's me in a nutshell today. Let's see. Let me grab some metal. And I will. Okay, so sweat soldering really is just soldering two flat pieces of metal together. It's pretty darn straightforward. So, several ways of approaching that. I am going to cut two pieces of metal. And I'm going to flatten it because I want to solder them together. And let's move things around a little bit here. All right. So here I've got two pieces of metal and I want to solder them flat together. So I'm going to put a little bit of flux. I'm going to go ahead and easiest thing to do, of course, is just to put some paste on there and boom, and put the two pieces on top of each other and it's done. But I have a little bit of solder left, so I'm just going to use it up and show you. All right. So we're going to heat that up a little bit, get that going. And then we'll grab the solder, put that right there. So I'm going to get this to flow just a little bit. You see the solder still sort of sitting there. So we're going to get that to flow just a little bit like so. Voila. Put this piece on. Heat it up. And what you're going to see is you're going to see these two pieces as they get hot suck together, literally. They come together and that should have worked. Okay, this is copper, so I always give it a second to think about it. See that? They are together. And you can see, you can barely see it, but there's a hairline of silver indicating that the pieces are together. So that's, oh yeah, see? You can see here too. Oh, I can see it. I don't know if you can see it. But anyway, so there it is. So pretty basic, pretty easy. Easier to do even with some paste solder than to do it this way. Anyway, okay, so that's me in a nutshell. Tonight is Wine on Wednesday at 4:30, so do join us if you're around, and if you're watching from overseas, hey, it's a good time to be drinking. Anyway, so thank you so much for joining us, whether it's on Twitch, YouTube, Facebook, or Periscope. Really appreciate it. Thanks for the shout outs. Do like our videos so that we can keep doing this. If you find any value in what you're watching, please consider downloading or downloading the instruction sheets or making a contribution. So, all right, that's me, and I will see everybody. Oh, I know, on Monday for the squared bracelet. So there we are. That's the squared bracelet on Monday at 1:30. Everybody else who I'm Zooming with, I'll see you on Friday, if not tonight. All right, have a great day, everyone. We'll see you guys later. Oh, I'm sorry, Monday at 1 o'clock. I didn't mean 1:30. Monday at 1 o'clock. Okay. Oops. Yeah, I know. I don't do this for a week, and I'm like totally out of whack. That's it. Oh, yeah. Oh, another shout out to Sully for doing this on Monday for me while I was traveling and working my way home from Virginia. We are officially home, so we can celebrate our 20th anniversary. Woohoo!